Today we'll explore visual storytelling in photography. Welcome back to the channel everyone, and welcome to this video about visual storytelling. In a video last week we discussed the idea of how we can choose our camera settings to further the story that we're trying to tell, and if you haven't seen that already, I recommend it as a good introduction to this week's video. In this week's video we're going to be exploring two more images from the perspective of deciding which settings to use and which equipment to use based on a composition and the story that we're trying to tell. Before we get into that, however, I want to share with you a project that my good friend Tomasz from Fujilove and Frames magazine is working on right now. This isn't a sponsored post or anything like that, it's just that Tomasz is working on something really interesting and I wanted to share it with you in the hopes that it will help you guys out. So what he's trying to do with Frames magazine is basically take all of the gear obsession and the numbers out of photography and talk more about what it is that drives us to make images. And he's been interviewing some really famous photographers and just hearing their voices and letting us know sort of what it is that drives them to make images. So at present, Frames magazine is a quarterly printed magazine that comes to your door and is filled with some of the most beautiful photography on the planet, but Tomasz wants to basically augment that with an app that will allow him to publish daily content, and that content won't be talking about camera settings, it won't be talking about new gear or anything like that. He'll basically be allowing 2 photographers a day to present their work and give you the stories behind it. So I figure that in a video like this we're talking about a very similar thing, albeit with a little bit of a gear focus, that I thought that this might be interesting for you guys as well. The app itself will be free to download and use, but Tomasz is currently funding the development of it through a Kickstarter campaign. Now I've chipped in and I've left the link below, so if you're interested in supporting something like this, please do head to the link below. So now on to today's topic. We'll be talking about 2 images that I took on a recent trip to Myanmar, and as you can see here, they're visually very different images, but I also took a very different approach to creating them, so we'll discuss the thoughts behind those here. Here's the first image. Take a moment to consider what I was trying to capture and why I chose the settings that I did. Then we'll dive into discussing the image. One of the things I love to do every time I visit Yangon is to spend a little time in the Yangon Central Railway Station. Since it's in a low-rise area of the city, it gets a lot of directional light in the early morning and late afternoon, which can be really good to work with for photography. It also is sort of a transport hub for everyone from businessmen to market sellers, and so it's sort of this hive of activity and really interesting characters, especially in the early mornings and late afternoons. When I saw this slash of light coming through, I knew immediately what I wanted to do. Since it was cutting the arches almost perfectly in half, I decided to go for a very geometric composition. So I found my position right in the middle of the arch so that I could see the other arches in the background as well. Since the light was coming in at this direction, anybody walking into the light would immediately get illuminated while the background stayed quite dark. So I wanted to wait for the perfect character to walk through this scene. I'm not a huge fan of having a lot of people in street photography compositions. I find that it gets a little bit too busy for my tastes. So despite the busyness of the early morning in the station, I really wanted to wait for just a single character. The other thing that I was waiting for was the right character to show that we were really in Myanmar. A lot of younger people in Yangon are now starting to dress in a very Western style. Jeans and t-shirts are very, very common, but I wanted an older character wearing the traditional longji to walk through to just give it that extra hint that we were actually in Myanmar. So once the right character started to enter my scene, I began to hammer the shutter button. I must have made 7 or 8 frames of this gentleman as he walked across, and the reason for that is I want to try and get the right footfall. I really like to have that sort of triangular shape with people's legs in my street photography images, so I was making sure, hedging my bets, to be able to get that. When I'm shooting street photography, I like to concentrate on the scene in front of me and be sort of able to adapt if light changes or if perhaps I see something interesting happening over there and I need to quickly go and shoot it. And so I usually work with aperture priority and auto ISO, and in this case with the X100F, that's exactly what I was doing. With this particular image, I chose f5.6, not because I wanted the depth of field. All my subjects were quite far away, so they would have been in focus anyway, but I wanted to get the best from the lens on the X100F. With f2 or f2.8, that lens is a little bit soft, and especially with high contrast scenes like this, it tends to get a little bit of glowing around high contrast edges. So I decided to stop down to f5.6 just to make sure I got a really sharp image where the actual technicalities of it didn't distract you from what was going on. So as I mentioned, the great thing about having your camera set up this way when doing street photography is that you're able to react quickly and shoot a lot of different scenes in a very short amount of time. So while I was waiting for the perfect character to walk through these arches, I actually made several other images within just a few meters of that spot using the gorgeous morning light, and I was able to just change my aperture and my exposure compensation and get a whole lot of images really, really quickly. So let's roll a few of those. Just to recap, the settings here were chosen to make working in an ever-changing environment easier. Working with aperture priority and auto ISO allows me to focus on the only element that I really care about in street photography, and that is depth of field. Since I was working in bright light, it was likely that my ISO would never get high enough to cause noise that I would need to worry about. Depth of field was also not really a concern here, since all the objects in my frame were some distance from the camera. So my choice of aperture was just to get the most from the lens of the X100F. Now had I had an X100V at that point, I would have been fine shooting it at f2 or f2.8 without any issues at all. The second image we'll talk about today takes a very different approach. Now as you can see, this is an environmental portrait, and this is a man by the name of Naren, who I met in the Naga self-administered zone in Myanmar. Before we jump into discussing the image, I'll give you a moment to study it again and consider why I chose the settings and the shooting method that I did. I met Naren in his small hilltop village, and as a part of my Tattoos of Asia project, I sat down to interview him about his tattoo and also about his past as a former headhunter for the Tanshan Naga people. He told me about defending his village as a young man and getting his tattoo as a result. He remembers that being a great honor and all of the villagers looking up to him. However, he's also quite happy that now his people are at peace and they don't have to go to war anymore, but he does miss feeling that honor and that respect that he got for being a great man, a defender of his village. So on to the photo itself. It was around lunchtime when we arrived in Naren's village, and the light was not ideal for the kind of portraits that I like to make. The sun was quite high in the sky. However, we did have a really beautiful scene and some really gorgeous clouds in the sky off to the right of the image, so I knew I wanted to make use of those. The other elements that I had in this scene were of course the hills. In the past, all Naga villages were on top of hills to make them easier to defend. And also, Naren's house was built in the traditional style, unlike some of the other houses in the village, so I knew that I had to include that. These things formed the basis for my composition. When it came to Naren himself, I asked him how he would like to be remembered, and he promptly asked one of his younger villagers to go inside and bring his spear, his machete, and his festival hat. So with all of those things in place, it was time to begin making the photograph. So as I mentioned, there were a lot of things that I wanted to include in this image. The first, of course, being these beautiful mountains in the background that represented his people's traditional culture, the amazing clouds that we had in the sky on this day, and also Naren's traditionally styled house. So getting all of that in presented a couple of problems. The first of those was keeping Naren large enough in the frame for him to be the focus of the image, and the second was going to be getting my flash in close enough to be able to light him effectively. To solve the first problem of Naren's size in the frame, I chose to use my 45mm f2.8 for the GFX, and what that is basically a medium wide-angle lens that allows me to get really, really close to my subjects. Now, as we know, physical proximity makes things render a little bit larger, so if you're close to them as you photograph them, they become larger in the frame. Now, the 45 allows me to get very, very close to Naren and ensure that he's the biggest part of the frame. In order to separate him a little bit from the background, I chose to work at f4, which, while it would keep depth of field through him, would allow the background to go a little bit soft while still letting you see what's back there. Since I did want Naren to remain quite large in the frame, stepping back to include everything else in the scene just simply wasn't an option. So I decided to opt for a panoramic image where I would make the first frame of just him and a little bit of his surrounds, and then make several other images to stitch together later in post-production. If you're interested in the process of doing that, I have made an entire video about it, and I will put a card here and link down below, so go and watch that if you're interested. My next challenge was to deal with the light in the scene. It was an extremely high contrast scene, and as you can see, the light to the left of the frame where the sun is extremely bright, but I still had to deal with the shadows under the awnings of Naren's house that would turn completely black. Since my image was about Naren's story, I decided to allow the sky to blow out a little bit in order to keep detail under the awnings in his house, which I felt were more important to him than today's sky was. That led me to a shutter speed of 1/640th of a second at my base ISO of 100, but with the harsh light coming from above, I'd still need to get some sort of fill light onto Naren to make sure that we could see him in the image. For my Tattoos of Asia project, I'm using a flash to maintain a consistent style. So I broke out the Godox 8200 to ensure that we could still see Naren in the image. With his back to his house, the sun was behind him and would create a nice rim to further separate him from the dark areas of the image. Once all of this was set, it was simply a case of beginning with an image of Naren. Now, I don't like to give my subjects for this project too much direction, because I feel like I've only spent, a few minutes with them. I don't know too much about them, and I don't want to sort of impose upon who they are. So I allowed him to basically come to a place and stand how he felt comfortable. And what he did was to throw his dao onto his shoulder and hold his spear to basically prop himself up. He's quite an old man, and so that became the basis of my image. I made a few different shots, with him looking at me, with him looking at the flash, and then from there, I allowed him to relax while I made a panorama of the rest of the scene. So let's recap the decisions I made in the process of making this image. The choice of the 45mm lens was so that I could get close to Naren and make him appear relatively large in the image. Because of this focal length though, I would need to make a panoramic image in order to get all of the elements that I wanted in my final image. I chose to work at f4, as that would give me enough depth of field to keep him in good focus, but also throw the background slightly out of focus. This resulted in a shutter speed of 1/640th of a second in order to retain some detail in Naren's house, as well as in the brighter areas of the sky. Finally, I added the flash in to illuminate Naren and really make him stand out in the image. So that wraps up today's video. I know that these two images are at pretty much polar opposites on the scale of difficulty when it comes to technical execution, but I do hope that the intent behind everything that I was trying to do here has been clear for you, and I hope that that helps you to, choose your camera settings in a more intentional way. As always, I hope this discussion has been helpful for you. If you have any questions about the topics we've discussed today, feel free to leave them below and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.